The snow fell thick and soundless over the Ardennes Forest, muffling the world into an uneasy hush. Pine branches sagged beneath its weight, and the narrow roads twisted through the trees like frozen veins. Somewhere in the darkness, engines idled, low, patient, restrained. A U.S. Army military policeman stepped into the road, raising his hand to stop an approaching jeep. The men inside wore American uniforms. Their helmets bore white stars. Their faces looked tired, cold, familiar. Yet something felt wrong. When the MP asked where they were headed, the driver answered confidently, but not quite right. His accent bent the words. His eyes lingered too long. In that moment, with the snow falling and the war seemingly winding down, the line between ally and enemy vanished. It was December 1944, and the war in Europe was supposed to be nearing its end. The Allied advance had crushed German resistance across France. Paris had been liberated months earlier. Allied supply lines stretched triumphantly from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany itself. American soldiers believed the enemy was retreating, broken, and close to collapse. Letters home spoke of Christmas dinners and victory parades. The future felt assured. But beneath the calm surface of Allied confidence, something else was moving. Deep within the forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler prepared one final gamble. A desperate, audacious strike meant not just to slow the Allies, but to fracture them from within. It would not rely on overwhelming force or superior firepower. Instead, it would weaponize confusion, imitation, and fear. It would turn the Allies' greatest strength, unity, into a vulnerability. The plan was called Operation Greif. At its center was a radical idea. German soldiers, fluent in English and trained in American mannerisms, would don stolen U.S. uniforms and slip behind enemy lines. They would drive captured jeeps, carry American weapons, and speak in American slang. Their mission was not simply sabotage, but psychological infection. They would reroute convoys, spread false orders, destroy communications, and most dangerously of all, make every American soldier doubt the identity of the man standing beside him. It was a deception so bold that many German officers believed it insane. Yet it was approved at the highest levels, entrusted to SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, a man already famous for daring operations behind enemy lines. He assembled a force from across the Reich. English-speaking soldiers, former students of American culture, men who had lived in the United States before the war. They studied slang, baseball trivia, Hollywood films. They practiced how to smoke, how to joke, how to walk like Americans. They rehearsed accents late into the night. But the war they were entering was not one of uniforms and flags. It was a war of recognition, of perception. And the slightest mistake could mean death. On the Allied side, few grasped what was coming. The American command expected an attack, but not one that wore their own face. Military police units were spread thin, tasked mainly with traffic control and prisoner handling. They were not trained to detect imposters who spoke their language and saluted their flag. When the German offensive erupted on December 16, 1944, it exploded with terrifying speed. Artillery thundered through the Ardennes. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Entire divisions were caught off guard. And somewhere behind the front lines, small groups of men in American uniforms began to appear, redirecting traffic, changing road signs, issuing false orders. At first, the reports sounded absurd. Soldiers claimed Germans were pretending to be Americans. Officers dismissed it as rumor, fatigue, or fear. But then the stories multiplied. Convoys vanished. Units ended up miles off course. A general's car was stopped at gunpoint by his own supposed troops. Panic crept in quietly. Soon, military police were stopping everyone. Passwords changed hourly. Questions were improvised on the spot. What was the capital of Illinois? Who played shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers? What was Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Wrong answers could mean arrest, or worse. The irony was merciless. The greatest army the world had ever seen, equipped with overwhelming firepower and industrial might, was suddenly paralyzed by doubt. Not because of tanks or bombs, but because of identity itself. In the frozen forests of Belgium, the war had entered a new phase. A battle not just of weapons but of belief. Not just of territory but of trust. And as the snow continued to fall and the lines between friend and enemy blurred beyond recognition, one truth emerged with chilling clarity. In modern war, the most dangerous weapon is not the one you can see, but the one that looks exactly like you. The winter of 1944 arrived not as a season but as a siege. Snow choked the roads of the Ardennes, icing engines and numbing fingers until even simple tasks became trials of endurance. For the American soldiers stationed along the quiet forest front, The cold felt like the final enemy to be defeated before the war ended. They believed the Germans were finished. They were wrong. In the weeks before the attack, Allied intelligence painted a reassuring picture. German divisions were shattered, their fuel nearly gone, their manpower exhausted. High Command concluded that the Ardennes, thick forest, narrow roads and brutal terrain, was the least likely avenue for a counteroffensive. It was precisely that certainty that made it irresistible to Adolf Hitler. In Berlin, the Führer envisioned a thunderclap that would reverse the war's momentum. His plan was audacious to the point of madness. A massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River, driving toward Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies in two. The Western Allies would fracture. Morale would collapse. Negotiated peace might follow. It was a fantasy built on dwindling resources and fading power, but one last roll of the dice. At the heart of this gamble was deception. Hitler approved a covert operation unlike anything attempted before. It would not rely on overwhelming force but on confusion, disguise, psychological terror. The operation was named Greif, and its architect was Otto Skorzeny, a man whose reputation bordered on legend. Tall, scarred, charismatic, and ruthlessly inventive, Skorzeny had once rescued Mussolini from captivity in a daring mountaintop raid. Now he was tasked with something even more dangerous, turning Germans into Americans. Skorzeny scoured the Reich for men who spoke fluent English. He recruited soldiers who had lived in the United States, who had worked as waiters in New York or students in Chicago before the war. He selected those who understood not just the language but the rhythm of American life. They were taught slang, profanity, gestures, and cultural habits. They studied baseball box scores. They memorized U.S. military insignia. They practiced walking like Americans, slouching like Americans, smoking like Americans. Captured U.S. Jeeps were repainted. Helmets were stolen from prisoners. Dog tags were forged. Even American-style cigarette packs were issued to complete the illusion. The goal was simple in concept and devastating in effect. Infiltrate behind Allied lines, misdirect traffic, alter road signs, spread false orders, sabotage supply routes, and, above all, create confusion so profound that the Allied advance would grind to a halt under its own suspicion. When the German offensive began on December 16, 1944, it struck with brutal surprise. Artillery lit the sky before dawn. Snow fell thickly, grounding Allied aircraft. Panzer divisions surged forward through sectors thought impossible to traverse. The Americans reeled. And then quietly the infiltrators went to work. They appeared at crossroads, confidently waving convoys down the wrong roads. They redirected fuel trucks into enemy hands. They sowed rumors that bridges were rigged with explosives. Some even posed as military police, checking papers and issuing false orders that sent entire units wandering miles off course. At first the reports seemed unbelievable. Soldiers laughed nervously at rumors of Germans dressed as GIs. But soon the evidence piled up. A patrol was stopped by men in American uniforms who asked oddly phrased questions. A Jeep crew couldn't name the hometown of the baseball player whose name was stitched on their jacket. A truck driver was detained because he didn't know who played center field for the New York Yankees. Fear spread faster than the Germans ever could. Within days the U.S. Army began to turn inward. Trust eroded. Soldiers eyed each other with suspicion. Military police erected checkpoints everywhere, stopping officers and enlisted men alike. Generals were forced to identify themselves. At one checkpoint, General Omar Bradley himself was detained until he correctly answered questions about American sports. The irony was sharp. The most powerful military force on earth had been psychologically disarmed by a handful of imposters. Meanwhile, the infiltrators paid a terrible price. Many were captured quickly. Some were shot on the spot as spies. Others were interrogated, tried, and executed. The laws of war offered no mercy to those wearing enemy uniforms. Skorzeny's men knew this when they crossed the lines. They went anyway. In interrogation rooms, captured commandos spoke of confusion and fear. Some admitted they had barely understood their orders. Others confessed they had gotten lost within hours. One German soldier later said, "We were more afraid of being discovered by Americans than of being killed in battle." Despite the chaos they caused, the operation failed to achieve its strategic aims. The bridges over the Meuse remained in Allied hands. The German advance stalled. Fuel shortages crippled their armor. And as the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. Yet the psychological impact lingered far longer than the military one. For weeks, American soldiers lived with the fear that the man beside them might not be who he claimed to be. Friendships were strained. Units grew tense. The war, which had once been about defeating a visible enemy, became a test of identity itself. The realization was chilling. Uniforms could lie. Accents could be learned. Trust could be manipulated. When the Bulge was finally crushed and the German retreat began, the battlefield told a story of shattered tanks and frozen bodies. But the deeper scars were invisible. The episode had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in modern warfare, one that technology could not easily solve. The war would go on for several more brutal months. Cities would burn. Millions would die. But something had shifted during those cold days in the Ardennes. The war had entered a psychological dimension from which it would never return. Men no longer looked at each other and saw allies or enemies. They saw uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lay the true legacy of Operation Greif. The moment when the battlefield became a mirror, and every soldier had to ask himself not only who the enemy was, but who he was himself. When the last shots of the Battle of the Bulge faded into the frozen forests, the Ardennes returned to a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, watchful, almost accusatory. Snow covered the wreckage of tanks and the bodies of men who had died wearing uniforms that, in some cases, were not their own. The great German gamble had failed. The front stabilized. The Allied advance resumed. And yet, something invisible lingered in the cold air long after the guns fell silent. Operation Greif did not change the course of the war in any strategic sense. It did not deliver Antwerp. It did not fracture the Allied coalition. It did not buy Germany the time it desperately needed. But it did something more subtle, and in many ways more enduring. It revealed how fragile the idea of certainty truly is in war. How easily trust can be dismantled. How thin the line is between order and chaos when identity itself becomes a weapon. For the American soldiers who survived the Ardennes, the experience never quite left them. Years later, veterans would recall the unease more vividly than the fighting. The sense that the enemy could be anyone, anywhere. A man asking for a light. A voice calling from the dark. A familiar uniform approaching through the snow. War had always been about killing the enemy. Now it was about recognizing them. The Germans who carried out the deception paid a terrible price. Many were executed as spies, denied the status of prisoners of war. Others vanished into camps or returned home bearing a different kind of wound, the knowledge that they had been trained not to fight as soldiers, but to impersonate their enemies. They were weapons built from imitation, discarded once their usefulness ended. In the years after the war, Otto Skorzeny would speak of Operation Greif with a mixture of pride and bitterness. He insisted it was misunderstood, that its psychological effect outweighed its tactical failure. Perhaps he was right. The operation did not win battles, but it altered the psychology of war. It demonstrated that deception, if wielded skillfully, could destabilize even the most powerful military machine. The Allied response to the experience reflected that realization. Intelligence protocols were rewritten. Identification procedures became more complex. New emphasis was placed on counterintelligence, verification, and internal security. Modern warfare, it became clear, would not only be fought with tanks and planes, but with information, impersonation, and doubt. In the decades that followed, this lesson echoed again and again. In the Cold War, spies replaced soldiers as the frontline warriors. In the digital age, deception migrated from uniforms to networks, from forged papers to forged identities. The battlefield expanded into minds and screens, and the questions first whispered in the Ardennes grew louder. Who can you trust? How do you know who is real? The men who froze in the forests of Belgium could not have imagined a world of cyber warfare and digital deception. Yet they lived its earliest chapter. They experienced firsthand what happens when appearances can no longer be trusted, when reality itself becomes contested terrain. There is a cruel irony in the story. The Germans, fighting for a regime built on rigid ideology and racial certainty, resorted to deception and impersonation as their final weapon. The Allies, fighting for freedom and openness, were forced to answer with suspicion and control. In that moment, the moral lines blurred, and war revealed its most unsettling truth, that survival sometimes demands becoming what you fear. And still, amid the fear and confusion, humanity endured. Soldiers protected one another. Strangers vouched for strangers. Acts of trust, small, quiet, and brave, persisted even when caution was the safer choice. The war did not erase decency, it tested it. When peace finally came, the world moved on. Cities were rebuilt. Nations healed. But the memory of those winter weeks remained etched in the collective consciousness of those who lived through them. Not as a story of victory or defeat, but as a lesson. A lesson that uniforms can lie. That appearances deceive. That identity, once taken for granted, can become a battlefield of its own. And perhaps that is the enduring legacy of the German infiltrators who dressed as GIs and walked into history wearing borrowed faces. They did not change the outcome of the war, but they exposed a timeless vulnerability at the heart of human conflict. In every era, in every struggle, there comes a moment when the greatest threat is not the enemy we see, but the one we fail to recognize. And in that moment, the question that once echoed through the frozen roads of the Ardennes still whispers to us today. Who are you really fighting, and how do you know?